Imagine standing in the Rocky Mountains in the winter of 1836. The Yellowstone River is frozen solid. Snow has buried the mountain passes. The wind is screaming through the valleys, and temperatures are falling toward 30 or even 40 degrees below zero. You have no modern sleeping bag, no insulated tent, no furnace, no electric heater. Sometimes, you do not even have a proper stove. And yet, you are expected to survive the next several months. For men like Osborne Russell and Jim Bridger, this was not a survival experiment. It was simply life. In 1836, Osborne Russell was camped along the Yellowstone River with Jim Bridger's brigade of roughly 60 men. Winter had arrived, and the trapping season was effectively over. The men were not going anywhere until spring, but they had a secret weapon against the cold. They went underground. The mountain men discovered that one of the best ways to survive a brutal Rocky Mountain winter was not to build a taller or stronger shelter above the ground. It was to dig into the earth. And the principle behind this simple idea was surprisingly advanced. Long before modern engineers studied thermal mass, geothermal heating, and passive insulation, indigenous peoples across North America had already been using the earth itself to protect their families from extreme temperatures. The mountain men learned from them. Between the 1820s and 1840s, thousands of fur trappers spread throughout the Rocky Mountains, the Great Plains, and the Sierra Nevada. They were chasing beaver. Beaver fur was incredibly valuable. In Europe and the eastern United States, beaver felt hats had become a major fashion symbol. But producing those pelts required men to live in some of the harshest environments on the continent. Trappers walked through freezing rivers, carried heavy rifles, traps, knives, food, and equipment, and spent months far from civilization. Then winter arrived, and winter in the Rockies was merciless. Temperatures could fall to -20, -30, and sometimes -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow could accumulate for months. The days were short, and the nights could last 14 or 15 hours. A man caught outside after dark could easily freeze to death. The problem wasn't simply low temperature. It was the combination of cold, wind, snow, moisture, and the enormous length of the winter season. A canvas tent provided very little protection. Wind pushed through every seam. The frozen ground pulled heat away from the body. And keeping a surface shelter warm required enormous amounts of firewood. A trapper could spend the entire night feeding a fire simply to remain alive. The mountain men eventually learned that they were fighting the environment instead of using it. So they changed their strategy. They dug down. The idea was not invented by the mountain men. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples across North America had developed sophisticated earth-covered and semi-subterranean homes. The Mandan and Hidatsa, for example, built enormous earth lodges along the Missouri River. These structures could be dozens of feet across. Heavy wooden posts supported a roof made from branches, grass, bark, and thick layers of packed earth. The walls themselves were made from earth. A central fire provided heat, while a smoke opening allowed smoke to escape. The thick earth surrounding the structure helped stabilize the temperature inside. Farther west, indigenous communities in the Plateau region built pit houses, sometimes called kekuli. These shelters were excavated into the ground and covered with wooden poles, branches, bark, and earth. During winter, snow could accumulate over the roof, adding another layer of insulation. Inside, a relatively small fire could keep the shelter surprisingly comfortable while a brutal storm raged outside. Mountain men encountered these technologies firsthand. Some lived among indigenous communities. Some married into native families. Others spent entire winters in indigenous villages. They watched how experienced communities selected shelter locations, constructed earth-covered homes, stored food, protected firewood, and prepared for winter. Then they adapted those techniques to their own needs. The result was the mountain man's dugout, a smaller, simpler version of the earth shelter. One or two men could build one with an axe and a shovel. First came the location. The trapper looked for a place protected by hills, rocks, or trees. The site needed sunlight, access to water, nearby firewood, and enough game to keep the men supplied. Protection from wind was especially important. Once the location was chosen, the trapper began digging. A typical dugout might be several feet deep, and roughly 8 by 10 feet across. The smaller the shelter, the easier it was to keep warm. The walls were simply the earth itself. Sometimes bark, hides, or branches were used to reinforce them. Then came the roof. Long poles were placed across the opening. Heavier logs could act as supports, while smaller branches created a lattice. On top came bark, brush, pine branches, grass, and finally thick layers of earth and sod. The roof could become extremely heavy, but that weight was exactly what made it effective. Earth is an excellent thermal mass. Instead of allowing temperatures inside to change rapidly with the outside air, the surrounding ground changes temperature slowly. And that is the key to understanding why these shelters worked. Imagine that the air outside is minus 30 degrees. A thin canvas wall immediately feels that temperature, but the earth several feet below the surface changes temperature much more slowly. The deeper you go, the more stable the temperature becomes. Modern engineers use this same principle in passive houses and geothermal heating systems. They take advantage of the fact that the ground is far more thermally stable than the air above it. The mountain men didn't have equations explaining thermal conductivity. They didn't need them. They knew what happened when they slept underground. The earth helped protect them from the extreme cold. The roof added another layer, and snow falling on the roof could make the shelter even more insulated. The entrance was also important. Instead of simply cutting a doorway directly into the shelter, some dugouts used a short tunnel or recessed entrance. This reduced the direct movement of wind into the living space. Inside, the trapped air became part of the insulation, and there was another source of heat that cost absolutely nothing. The men themselves. A resting human body continuously produces heat. Put several men into a small, well-insulated shelter, and their combined body heat becomes surprisingly significant. In a large, drafty tent, that heat disappears almost immediately. Inside a compact earth shelter, much more of it remains. Then, if conditions were severe, the men could light a small fire. They didn't need a massive bonfire. The shelter was already preventing heat from escaping rapidly. The fire simply added another source of warmth. This was the genius of the dugout. It did not try to defeat winter. It worked with the environment. The earth blocked the wind. The underground walls stabilized the temperature. The thick roof slowed heat loss. Snow could add insulation. The small interior concentrated body heat. And a modest fire could make the shelter even warmer. Compared with a canvas tent, the difference was enormous. A tent in a powerful wind was constantly losing heat. A dugout was surrounded by thermal mass. One was exposed. The other was protected. But surviving winter wasn't only about shelter. The mountain men also had to survive months without easy access to supplies. They needed meat. They needed firewood. They needed dry ammunition. They needed to protect their horses. And they needed something to do during the long winter nights. Winter camps became small communities. Meat was stored and protected from predators. Weapons were cleaned. Moccasins and clothing were repaired. Bullets were cast. Equipment was maintained. Stories were exchanged around the fire. Some trappers could read and would read aloud to others. Arguments, debates, jokes, and stories filled the long hours between sunset and sunrise. After months of dangerous trapping, winter became a period of relative rest. But that rest was only possible because the shelter worked. Without protection from the cold, there would be no peaceful winter camp. There would only be survival. The difference between life and death could come down to where a man decided to sleep. And this is where indigenous knowledge becomes one of the most important parts of the story. The mountain men did not independently discover all of these techniques. They learned from people who had already spent countless generations understanding the North American environment. Indigenous builders understood where wind traveled. They understood how snow behaved. They understood which materials resisted water. They understood how much earth to place over a roof. And they understood the importance of putting people below the direct effects of the weather. The mountain men borrowed those lessons because they worked. Survival rewarded practical knowledge, regardless of where it came from. One of the most important figures in this world was Jim Bridger. Born in 1804, Bridger entered the Rocky Mountain fur trade as a teenager. He spent decades traveling through the wilderness. He learned native languages, married into native communities, and developed an extraordinary understanding of the Western landscape. He became famous for stories about Yellowstone, geysers, mountains, and strange natural formations that many people back east initially thought were exaggerated. But Bridger understood something that many outsiders didn't. The wilderness could not simply be conquered. It had to be understood. The same lesson applied to winter. A strong man could still freeze to death. A brave man could still die in a blizzard. A skilled hunter could still lose everything if he chose the wrong camp. The men who survived were often the men who knew when to stop. They knew when to find shelter. They knew when to preserve their firewood. They knew when to stay put instead of crossing another mountain pass. And they knew when the earth itself could become their best protection. Jedediah Smith represented a different kind of mountain man. He was famous for pushing into dangerous territory and refusing to be intimidated by the wilderness. He survived a devastating grizzly bear attack in 1823. He continued exploring despite enormous injuries and hardships. But his story also demonstrates the danger of constant movement. Eventually, in 1831, Smith was killed along the Cimarron River. He was only 32. The lesson was clear. The wilderness did not care how tough you were. It rewarded preparation. Another famous mountain man, Kit Carson, also learned the importance of choosing the right winter environment. When winter arrived, the smart move was often to find a valley where game was available, water could be reached, and shelter could be constructed quickly. Survival wasn't about proving how much suffering you could tolerate. It was about avoiding unnecessary suffering in the first place. And that is why the dugout was so effective. It was simple. It was cheap. It could be constructed quickly. It required no manufactured insulation. It required no furnace. And once finished, it turned the earth into a massive protective wall. There are later examples showing just how effective dugout homes could be. In 19th century Utah, families sometimes lived in partially underground homes that maintained surprisingly stable indoor temperatures despite extreme outdoor conditions. The principle was the same. The earth absorbed and released heat slowly. That meant a shelter could remain relatively cool in summer and comparatively warm in winter. Modern buildings now use sophisticated insulation materials, heating systems, ventilation systems, and geothermal technology to accomplish some of the same goals. The mountain men had an axe, a shovel, some poles, branches, and dirt. That was enough. Of course, dugouts were not perfect. They could become damp. Poor ventilation could create dangerous conditions. A badly constructed roof could collapse. A fire inside a poorly ventilated shelter could produce deadly smoke. And digging into unstable ground could be extremely dangerous. But when properly built, the dugout gave a trapper something priceless. Time. Time to wait out the storm. Time to conserve firewood. Time to survive until spring. That was the real advantage. The mountain men didn't need to make winter comfortable. They only needed to make it survivable. For 5 or 6 months, the Rockies could become a frozen world. Rivers disappeared beneath ice. Mountain passes became impossible to cross. Animals struggled to find food. Snow covered the landscape. And inside a small hole in the ground, a few men could wait. They could sit around a small fire. They could repair their equipment. They could eat stored meat. They could tell stories. And outside, the temperature could fall to 30 degrees below zero. The difference was not strength. It was shelter. The mountain men of the Rocky Mountains are often remembered for their rifles, their traps, their horses, their beards, and their adventures. But one of their greatest survival tools was something much less dramatic: the ground beneath their feet. They learned from indigenous peoples who had spent generations adapting to the North American climate. They took that knowledge into the mountains. They dug into the earth. They covered themselves with soil and branches. They blocked the wind. They conserved their firewood. And they survived winters that could kill an exposed person in minutes. Long before scientists described thermal mass, passive insulation, and geothermal energy, these people understood the most important principle of all. Sometimes the best way to survive the cold is not to fight it. You simply have to get underground. And while the world above freezes, the earth beneath you is quietly holding onto the warmth of summer. That simple idea helped keep generations of mountain men alive until the rivers thawed, the snow melted, and spring finally returned to the Rockies.